Thanks everybody for joining us this evening. My name is Malcolm Joyce, Pro-Vice Chancellor for Research and Enterprise here at Lancaster, and you're here for one of our public lectures. These are exercises really to reach out into our local community, lectures by academic experts from around the world and Lancaster colleagues as well. If it's the first one you've been to, we do move around venues, so please keep in touch, keep aware of the programme, but bear that in mind when you're planning to come to them in the future. So it's a great pleasure this evening to introduce Mr. Biraj Patnaik. Biraj is an international human rights practitioner and executive director of the National Foundation for India. Biraj is a regular commentator in the media and has published widely in both academic and popular media. Biraj's lecture, we're really pleased to welcome him here at Lancaster tonight. I think he's had a couple of interesting and exciting days. I hope you're not exhausted by my colleagues. His lecture will explore the right to food, rising inequality, climate change shaping the global food crisis, something that's, I think, at the focus, hopefully, of everyone's mind at the moment. He'll chart the journey of what a fundamental right to food entails in law and practice and look at how countries might respond to these challenges. So it's an honour to have Biraj with us here tonight, and so without any more of a delay, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Biraj, and please take the stage.
So thank you very much, Professor Joyce. Thank you to the Department of Sociology, Sadia and Jasmine and other colleagues for having me here. I'm really delighted. It's my maiden visit to Lancaster, so thank you for having me over. Coincidentally, Tom, who's my oldest friend in the UK, we've known each other for 25 years. His father was I think the founder, or at least the head of the first head of the Department of Sociology back in the day in the 1960s, and headed up the School of Independent Studies here. So thank you, Tom, and other friends who've traveled from other parts of the UK to be here today. A PowerPoint really at this stage in the evening is powerless and pointless, as most of you would agree. But I do have a few slides just to make a few points, especially where there's data. So I'll start with that. But I want to make a link really to our work. Before I was heading up NFI, I was the South Asia Director of Amnesty International. And of course, before that, for almost 2 decades, more than 2 decades, I was involved with the Right to Food campaign in India. And I helped the Indian Supreme Court, because I was appointed by the courts, to head up a very unique mechanism to monitor and put in place the food programming that we have in India today, which has survived the last 10 years of the new government. So I'm going to speak about that, but I just want to start looking at some of the basic facts most of you are familiar with. Now, rising inequality, it's a global phenomena. It's not unique to India. We know, for instance, every year Oxfam, and much of this data is from the Oxfam Inequality Report. So we have the 5 richest men who've seen their fortunes double since 2020. 69% of private wealth is held in just 21% of the world's population, so which is in the global north. In India, the top 1% own 40.5% of national wealth, and the top 10% own about 77% of national wealth. You know, these figures have tripled in the last 15 years. India is number 3 in the world on the list of billionaires. We have 271 billionaires. After the US and China, we're number 3. It's also one of the poorest countries in the world if you look at the number of people living in poverty. And 94 of these billionaires were added in 2023 alone. So that's the kind of inequality that we are talking about. And it's the same here in the UK, where the bottom 50% own less than 5% of the wealth, and the top 1% own 23%. and the top 10% hold 57% of national wealth. So this is well known. It's, every time you look at these figures, they look very stark. They say, we wonder how we got here, but it's a global phenomenon. India is not alone in this. And yet, as in with the rest of the world, it's the poor who pay more taxes, because you have direct taxes, which is income tax, which most people associate with tax, but there's also indirect taxes, as we know. Every commodity, every time you buy food, you buy soap, you buy a car, you pay a tax. And the poor end up paying more taxes than the rich, of course. So 64% of taxes paid in India, whereby the bottom 50%, whereas the top 10% paid less than 4% of the taxes. Again, something that you're very familiar with being in the UK, because it's a bit of a money laundering hub, as we know, the City of London. Most people would start up here to avoid paying taxes. So this is tax dodge central as a country, and the figures would look as bad, if not worse, here. And yet, India ranks 105th out of 127 countries in the world on the Global Hunger Index. More than a third of our children are stunted, about 20% remain undernourished. We have the world's highest rate of wasting. Children just wasting, it's about 18.7%. So that's the other reality of India. And 80% plus of Indians are dependent on food aid. 80% plus of Indian families receive free food grain as part of a program that I was, amongst many others, as a foot soldier responsible for putting in place with the government. So that's really where we rank, much worse than, just above North Korea, much worse than many other countries which are comparable economies, whether it's Vietnam or Thailand or Malaysia or Philippines, comparable in terms of per capita income and so on. And to add insult to injury, we're just below Pakistan for most Indians. And if you look at the global climate crisis, on the other hand, it's a situation that's exacerbating the food crisis. Again, India is not unique to this. It's across the global south. We know that climate has a differential impact on communities. So if you're in a poorer community or you come from a disadvantaged background, any disaster or any extreme weather event will have a differential impact on you. It'll be worse off for you than if you were from a community that's better off. So floods in Lancaster would, I imagine, be much worse than, say, floods in London, or would impact communities worse if you're from the Lake District or from a poorer part of the UK than it would be in the larger cities. So we've seen the worst record. Again, not something I need to stress about. You've just been through a nice summer. And it's the same everywhere. Delhi touched 50 degrees last year. It's expected to go up to 55 degrees, which is just beyond levels that humans can habitate in another 10 years. And again, a phenomena that is leading to greater food insecurity, and it's almost double, because the world hasn't seen a post-pandemic recovery. In economic terms, the recovery that India is witnessing, as are large parts of the global south and the global north, is what is called a K-shaped recovery, where the poorer are getting poorer, and those who are better off are having a much higher rate of recovery. So in India, for instance, those 94 billionaires were added because of this K-shaped recovery. Also, of course, for local factors and bad policies, bad management. But again, that's not unique to India. It's across the world. And if you look at the spiraling climate crisis with reference to India, India is amongst the top 10 countries that are vulnerable to extreme weather events. Large subcontinental size, very long coastline, predictions of significant amounts of areas under the coastline going under the sea, with just a 1.5 degree rise. And by all predictions, we're going to go higher than that. 2022, for instance, saw thousands of people across the country die because of the heat waves. Vastly underreported, of course. That's, again, not new to India, because the average, if you look at the numbers, what you see for a decade or 5 years here as quoted, which are the official numbers, the numbers are much higher, because typically a heat stroke has a chance of survival of 30 to 40%. But in India, if you look at the figures, we are officially reporting only a 3% increase in mortality during that. So if you look at the data for all deaths for the period of the summer, we're just reporting a 3% increase, which is not possible. We had floods, say in 2020, the last estimate we have impacted 345 million people, and every extreme weather event is causing huge disruption. We just had the cyclone in Florida, which was televised, and you could see the damage that did. Now imagine that happening in India with extremely poor communities, fisherfolk communities living on the coastline. It's an absolutely devastating event because it essentially wipes out your life savings and pushes you back into poverty. So the impact that has on the overall levels of food crisis that people face are huge. And by 2050, the prediction is that approximately 30% of Indian, the arable land under where you grow crops, agricultural land, almost 30% would face severe degradation or become infertile due to the climate crisis. And again, because of the fact that in large parts of India where food is grown, particularly in the states of Western India, West and Northern India, you have a very high level of use of fertilizers and pesticides. So these are some data that I have here, which just gives you a sense, because rice and wheat are our major crops, at the kind of crisis that we are looking at. And if you look at the Global Climate Risk Index, India is amongst the 10 most vulnerable communities to climate change. But as I had promised, that would be hopefully my last slide. So you can switch this off. Thank you. So where does that leave the right to food or the situation of hunger that the world is facing today, where you have, according to the WHO, more than 800 million people across the world who are hungry? And how do countries really cope with this? Now, I don't have answers really, because as I was telling Jasmine, I'm always nervous to face an audience these days talking about these issues, because there's somebody out there who says, okay, so PowerPoint with 3 points where we can solve this. I wish I could do that. But I do feel that we have the answers. We just don't have the ability or the political will to reach where we need to reach. But if I go by my own experience on working on the right to food, we really started work in the 1990s when starvation deaths in India were not uncommon in the 90s. And a starvation death is literally somebody withering away in front of your eyes in a community without food. And communities take care, and often these, caste and gender, they intersect every section or every area of life in India. India is unique in two ways. We are global front runners in the way we discriminate against women, and we are possibly global front runners in discrimination overall, because we have the caste system, which is it's the oldest institutionalized system of repression which still survives in the world, where you can be polluted by touch, you can be polluted by sight of another human being. No other society has this other than us. So I always say that in these two things, South Asia and India in particular has a competitive advantage from the rest of the world. So a starvation death would typically impact somebody from a lower caste, a Dalit family, or somebody from an indigenous community. And that's when was ironically also a time when India had some of the largest grain reserves in the world. And my friend and colleague of the Right to Food campaign, Professor Jean Drèze, the amount of food grains we were holding at that point, Jean had calculated that if you put one stack over the other, you can reach the moon and come halfway down. And yet, you had large-scale deaths across the country. And that's when the People's Union for Civil Liberties, which was a human rights organization of lawyers, they went to the Indian Supreme Court to argue that it was a very simple petition. And the argument was that despite the fact that India, in its constitution, does not have a fundamental right to food, because when we did the constitution in 1947, as a newly independent post-colonial country, you'd know something about that, we were a very poor country. And there was an argument that you couldn't have fundamental rights which were economic and social rights, because the state did not have the funds to guarantee it. So we put it as progressive rights, or directive principles of state policy, as we called it. So there is no fundamental right to food in the Indian Constitution at that point when we went to the Supreme Court. But the argument was very simple, that India, in its constitution, has a right to life. And there was a lot of jurisprudence around the right to life, as to what constitutes a right to life. And the Supreme Court had, in a number of judgments in the early 70s, mid-70s and thereafter, argued that the right to life is a right to life with dignity. And our argument was that you cannot have a right to life exercised without a right to food. And that was what PUCL argued, essentially. So that was one. On the other hand, you also had a massive farm crisis in India, and that's not gone away. It still exists. India is the epicenter of farmer suicides. Government stopped collating data because the numbers were so high and subject to so much criticism. We have a simple solution when we have a problem. We stop collecting the data and the problem goes away. Or we do not allow independent research. Or God forbid any organization does their own research, then we sort them out. So we stopped collecting the data. But when we had the data, between 1996 and 2014, 250,000 Indian farmers, more than 250,000 Indian farmers had committed suicide. And these suicides were largely due to debt. And this was not known widely outside India. It's still not known that India is the world's epicenter of farm suicides, because the average land holding is less than 2 hectares. And any event, be it a drought or flood, can just wipe you completely, and you're indebted. You had a switch to commercial crops, to GM foods, which were very capital intensive. You took loans, you couldn't pay them back, and you were then, and in fact, Tom and I were involved in a project back in the day, again in the late 90s, early 2000s, where we did a farmers' jury critiquing the entire model, where we actually showed how the state policy towards GM was flawed and being pushed by industry. So when we made these arguments to the court in 2001, and we were not expecting this, the court passed an order which essentially said, a judgment which said that, look, we agree with the petitioners that the right to food is a fundamental right that cannot be removed from the right to life. And so with one stroke, they declared the right to food a fundamental right. And in India, I guess like in the UK, a Supreme Court order carries the weight of legislation. And so the government was asked, okay, now this is a right, what are you going to do to make it justiciable? To which the state came up with a number of programs that they had, because they said, oh, we have a great welfare architecture, it covers children under the age of 6. Before that, it covers pregnant mothers. Then you have programs like the public distribution system that will allow you to access food grains through your life, and so on and so forth. And if you die, your family gets something if you are below the poverty line for the funeral expense or support or whatever it is. So from the cradle to the grave, or rather the womb to the tomb, you had a program covering India, so we are good. And that's what the government said. And so the courts then said, wonderful, but now that we've declared it a right, these become entitlements, which means that they are justiciable. So please explain to us how are you going to make that happen? And then, of course, over 200, it took us 20 years and almost 20 years, and 200 court orders over that period to create this entire architecture of the food system that you have in India today, the state subsidy system, which is why the stats for India don't look much worse than what I have shown. And to just give you an example, for instance, school meal program. Now we now have a universal school meal program. But back in the day, we had a school meal program which was restricted to 50 tiny pockets, and it was dry rations. And at that stage, when we went to the court and the government said, look, we give these rations, and they were contingent on on attendance, right? If you attended school at the end of the month, if you had 80%, you got a kilo of rice. So we argued that a school meal program should actually be a hot cooked meal that is cooked at the school premises, and it should be provided by the state. And we showed how that program could have a extremely positive outcome on enrollment, not just overall enrollment, but girls' enrollment in particular. And of course, it was borne out by evidence later on. But at that time, we showed it from those states in India where these programs had been effective, because otherwise the girl child would be at home doing sibling care rather than in school. And we then made the calculations for what it would cost to cover 120 million school children and presented it to the court and said that since this is an entitlement and a justiciable right, the state has to provide the money to make this program happen. And of course, the government threw a fit, saying, this is legislative business. You can't have a Supreme Court that tells us what budgetary allocations to make for a program. We just don't have, 120 million school kids to be in primary school to be covered by a universal school meal. It's impossible. It's not happening. I mean that's what they said. And I was there in court on the day this order was passed, and very patiently the judge heard them out, the state, and then he turned to the Solicitor General and said, Mr. Solicitor General, after 50 years of independence, you can't tell us that you don't have the funds to feed the children. Tighten your belt elsewhere. That's exactly what he said. He said, tighten the belt elsewhere, but you have to have this program. And of course, government found the money, because they put a 2% cess on petrol, and that funded not just the school meal program, because the Prime Minister then was quite convinced that he needed to do that. It was a politically popular program, step to take. So they just put a 2% cess on petrol, which not just covered the school meal program, but also covered the entire gamut of primary school education, the entire Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan program, as it was called, from the state. So from a position where the state had absolutely refused to get into this, and this happened in program after program. So after having done this, we went with the Integrated Child Development Services, the creche program that covers 160 million children in India. It's the only institutional mechanism to reach children under the age of 6. And so we presented the stats to the court and we said, triple it. The coverage now is not enough. It has to be 3 times as much, and the budgetary allocation has to be almost 7 times of what you have now. And after a lot of back and forth, it did happen. And so you had a slew of programming that came up. I was, of course, involved in the petition, but at some stage, a lot of state governments and the government of India they were misrepresenting data that was given to the court. And it came to a head, I remember, because there was this program for the poorest of the poor, where they were to be provided free food grains. And 8 states actually, filed an affidavit in court that the only reason they don't have this program is because they don't have anyone whom they can classify in their states as the poorest of the poor. And if you go to Delhi was one of them, Himachal was one of them, Uttarakhand was one of them. It's an extraordinary claim. Even I think Sweden or Norway or Finland wouldn't be able to make this claim. And that's when the Supreme Court said, we're not going to take this. They appointed an independent mechanism of court commissioners with very wide powers, and that was the mechanism that I was involved in, running the commissioner's office, which would monitor these schemes and report directly to the bench of the court. And in case the program was not delivering or there was a misrepresentation, then we had the power to take the highest officials of the land on contempt of court. So we could have them summoned by the court for contempt, which meant that you had a situation where you would have 7 or 8 heads of the state bureaucracies being summoned to court, or the head of the bureaucracy overseeing a particular ministry being summoned to court and being asked on why there was no delivery. And at some point in the mid 2010s, we were overseeing programs of almost 25, 30 billion US dollars a year. And so we also had the political opportunity structure because there was a government in power which respected or at least recognized the role of civil society. And therefore we had an institutional mechanism to work with government. And so we used that to tell the government that why are you allowing 5 people sitting in a small office in Delhi give you on a day-to-day basis instructions on how to run the state. So why don't you just legislate us out of the picture? Just legislate the code out of the picture by passing a law which makes the right to food a fundamental right and build within it the mechanisms, the budgetary provisions, and the administrative recourse, the grievance redressal, so that the court and the court commissioners are out of your hair. And the government did that. So we had the National Food Security Act in 2013. Just before that, we also managed to get legislated the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, which today in India guarantees 100 days of labor, 100 days at minimum wage to every rural household in the country. And now it's being replicated in urban areas. So I'm saying this just to say that even in very unequal society like India, where it's politically very divided, resources are at a premium, states are always starved of funds, it is possible to make things happen. And India is a good example of where we had it. When in 2004 the government changed, our current Prime Minister, who's not particularly fond of not generally not very fond of rights and was is particularly not fond of the right to food. He declared in Parliament that some of these programs he would keep them going only and only because they would be a monument to the failure of the government of the past. Because he wanted them going because people should know what a monumental failure the past was and that new India would prosper. And so we thought, well, of course, it's the death knell of these programs. But when COVID happened, not only did these programs get considerably strengthened, but the subsidized food grains that we had proposed for 75% of Indians in rural area and 25% and 50% in urban areas, they are now almost near universal, and the government of India is bankrolling it completely, which means people get the food grains free of cost. We as civil society had never made an argument for that. But the state realized that post-COVID, that was the only way that you could have a recovery where you provided food grains, because we did not have a furlough scheme like you had in the UK. The state did not want to take on any additional liabilities at that point. They had not created any infrastructure for 10 years that they were in power, or 7 years at that point that they were in power, which could do this kind of large-scale social programming. So the National Rural Guarantee Act, which the Prime Minister wanted to retain as a monument of people's failure, it's a universal program. Most of these programs are universal because the cost of means testing is higher than the cost of just providing it to everybody. And in any case, they are self-targeting. I will not go, I'm physically not capable of going and digging a ditch in 45 degrees to earn my minimum wage. So it's a self-targeting program. And the merit of that was that the moment COVID struck and you had a large number of factory workers who were out of jobs because of the factory shutting down, could immediately go back to their villages, and they had 100 days of employment and minimum wage available to them. And of course, when the factories reopened, they abandoned their work sites and went back to the factories. So here was a program that actually saved not just the government, but rescued the economy, because India is primarily still an agriculture-based economy. A large proportion, significantly large proportion of our GDP is from agriculture or allied sectors. It's changing now. It's transitioned to the services sector, but it'll still take us 25 years to significantly transition it. So any impact on the rural economy is huge because it completely changes the overall macroeconomics. So, because rural consumption is still the engine of the overall economic growth of India. So, I'm saying this just to illustrate that even as a case study, that a country with little resources can also achieve this. And India is not alone. A lot of our work, for instance, built on the work that was being done globally. At the time that we started in the early 2000s, there were already 9 countries in the world which in some form or the other had, in the global south, had legislated the right to food as a fundamental right. By the mid-2000s, Brazil had become an absolute pioneer under the first presidency of Lula with the Forma Zero program, the Zero Hunger program, the school meal program, Bolsa Escola, the cash transfer program, Bolsa Familias, and so on. So we built on what was happening in other parts of the global south, as indeed a lot of Latin American countries today are taking a lead in trying to look at it again from the climate lens. Because like with India, it's very clear that, I mean, forget the big production figures, that if we have to deal with the crisis, we have to change the way we produce our food, because agriculture here in Lancaster, is there any here, or in the UK or in Germany or wherever? I'm not sure about agriculture in Lancaster, but is essentially a process where you convert oil into food grains. And that's a process that's not going to work. So industrial agriculture is just not, I mean, you have to move back to family farming and to more sustainable means, which essentially means that what is more critical is not just how much food you produce, but also how it is produced, because that's not an option. Where inequality comes into the picture is that, one, of course, it exacerbates the climate crisis, as we know. Consumption is a huge factor which exacerbates the climate crisis. It also leads to the creation of monopolies. So you have, if you look at, I mean, one aspect that India is more fortunate than, say, you are in the UK, or for large parts of the global north, is that our food chains are still not as corporatized as yours are. So you don't have supermarket chains which control the food chains. Food is still pretty much grown, processed, consumed locally. Government is the largest procurer of food, because government holds strategic food reserves, of staple crops, which it buys from farmers at a minimum support price, at a guaranteed price, because left to the market, prices would completely crash because of demand-supply logic at harvest time. And then that goes into providing the food to poor consumers, which today in India is about 850 million people. It would be about at least 100 million more if we had a census. But we haven't had the census yet. The decadal census hasn't happened, but that would add about another 100 million to the numbers. So government is the largest procurer of food. And it also uses the food reserves to deal with inflation. So if in one particular part of the country prices go up, government has the food reserves to flood that area with subsidized food. So it's a market intervention mechanism as well. And that gives us a greater control. Similarly, at the ground level, we don't have the corporatization of agriculture that you have here. So we don't have contract farming, large-scale contract farms. The average land holding, as I said, was less than 2 hectares. So that gives us much better policy options. It also allows us to control better one dimension of malnutrition, which is growing in India, but not as alarmingly as it has here, which is obesity. Because obesity is directly linked to the corporatization of food chains, as is the food miles which are gutting the planet. You know, of course, you have access in a supermarket to flowers from Kenya and cocoa from Colombia, but the price that the planet pays to put that into the shelf is the price that the corporatization of the food system has, the impact that it has on all of us. So we are somewhat fortunate that we have been able to resist and we are not alone in this. Many countries in the global south have been able to resist it, which is why we will have a better chance perhaps than the global north in dealing with the obesity epidemic, which is huge. Because if you look at non-communicable diseases that derive from obesity, the amount of public money that goes into it is huge. I'm told, I reliably learn, but there's some discussion in UK on using Ozempic to get people back to work. Well, good luck with that. So that's, I hope we don't have to do that. That's an anti-diabetes drug which also is used for slimming. But I'm saying we do have a better chance to do that. But where we are failing is inequality. Because with inequality comes monopolies, greater corporate control, and a shrinking of civic space like you've never seen before. And we have experienced it because the moment you challenge the monopoly of the corporation, you get crushed. And oftentimes governments are very, very closely aligned with corporations, not just here, but across the world. But in other parts of the world, unlike here, there are very real consequences for civil society organizations which are working. I cannot imagine doing any of this work that we did, whether it was in healthcare, on education, or on the right to food, or creating a series of rights between 2004 and 14 happening now. We do not have the space. So I think I'll end here so that we have a little more time to do a more engaged discussion. Thank you very much for having me over, and over to the moderator for the questions.
Thank you very much for a fascinating insight, and I'm sure you've generated a great deal of interest from the audience. We've got a roving mic, which is a little ironic because I should be using my roving mic, I guess. Play by the rules. So if you have a question, just give us 2 seconds for one of my colleagues to get to you, Sarah or Abby, with the mic. Who'd like to go first? Please raise your hand if you have a question. I'll try and keep track. Just over here.
Hi, thank you. I had a pleasure to listen to you speak yesterday as well, and thank you so much for this really interesting presentation, and also thank you for your sense of humor, because when we talk about such sort of depressing things, sometimes a little bit of dark humor is really helpful. And I know you said that you don't have a PowerPoint with 3 solutions, unfortunately. However, can you maybe take us through, if you can, the role of civil society that is under pressure, that is sort of very much co-opted by the funding that is basically non-existent anymore? And is there a sort of way to mobilize, whether it's in India or even here? And also, what is the role of academia in this? I mean, we're totally being squeezed out from certain countries, whether you're talking about India or Hungary, and then here in UK, we're also being squeezed out in a different ways through limited funding, through deficit, and basically non-investment in higher education by our government. Thank you.
Yeah. So should we take a bunch of questions and then
I think
we'll do that?
One here.
Mine was a very simple question.
Yeah.
You mentioned.
If you could also introduce yourself when you do that. Thanks.
Oh, hi. My name's Duncan Hallam. Anyway. You mentioned when you were talking about agriculture in this country, you said that we're doing a lot of turning oil into food. And I just wondered if you could expand on that and what actually you meant. Because I couldn't, I interpreted it one way, you might not have meant it that way.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And one more, perhaps? We've got just one at the front here.
Lillian Eldefani. I just wondered, you said that the food capacity was going to diminish hugely in India. Does the government realise this, and what are the plans? Are there any plans? Because that's a big population to feed.
Okay, so I'll start with your question, Duncan, on what I meant. Well, all forms of industrial agriculture are so energy intensive that for all practical purposes, all you're doing is converting oil to food, right? Because you have, like, I remember once Tom offered to take me to a small farm in the UK, and that was 900 acres, right? And it had more accountants than people farming, because at that time, this is pre-Brexit, it was, you had the European Common Agriculture Program. So it was a farm system that literally had 3 people growing the food, very, very fertilizer, pesticide, intensive crop. And if you go to North America or other parts of the world, it's genetically modified crops. So the entire process is controlled very closely by corporates, whether it's the inputs, the supply chain, the very little of the consumer's money, pound, dollar, rupee, goes back to the consumer. And it's incredibly energy intensive. It's not going to work. So that's what I meant. I mean, maybe somebody will come up with solar tractors and make an argument that we could make it work then, but it's not going to work. On the question of whether the government realizes, yes, they do. This is a question, of course, of great alarm. And different governments are reacting to it differently. Some governments, for instance, are buying up copious amounts of land in Africa to do their farming. India at one stage went through that. Millions of hectares of land was being bought elsewhere so that we can farm for Indians, not for Africans. The Chinese have done there. Every year, I think the amount of land that's being bought in the global south in poorer countries is equivalent to the size of France. Because some people think that's the solution. The current policy thinking in India essentially involves around more of the same, which is, of course, we do have a productivity problem because the amount of crops we produce from the same hectare of land is a third or a fifth often of what is produced here. But we think that that's the way forward. So we will invest in more capital intensive, more energy intensive farming, because we are looking at ensuring food security for a very limited time frame, right? And for a very limited set of people, without having a global overview on what that will do to the planet. And that's the kind of short-term thinking that is sort of dominating the climate mitigation and adaptation attempts of most governments, I would say. There are a few governments, particularly the small island nations, who have more skin in the game because they won't be around for too long the way things are going. Or governments in Latin America who are completely questioning even the normative framework of human rights to the point that they are saying that rivers have rights. Their courts are ruling that rivers have rights. Their governments are coming up with frameworks which would include the rest of nature as part of human rights, to say that, you can't have a very anthropocentric point of view, even for human rights, because it's not going to work with the climate emergency. But that's not a mainstream movement yet. It's being led by small peasant groups or large movements like La Via Campesina and others who are pushing for it. But we are up against a very significant challenge of dealing with agribusiness to counter this. So it's not very encouraging as to what India is doing. I wish we did more. We're doing well on energy, on the energy transition. We're doing reasonably well. We will meet our net zero targets, but it won't be enough. Not for India, not for the world. On civil society, of course, and thank you for asking that. Look, as Dr. Ambedkar, who wrote our constitution, said, he said, the only way is educate, agitate, organize. There is no other way. There is no other solution. We will have to do that. It will come at a price. The unfortunate reality, as you said, is that on one hand, of course, the political opportunity structures available for civil society have shrunk. On the other hand, politics has moved so far to the right that, and it's not about India, right? It's not, I mean, look at Europe. It's heartbreaking to see what's happening in Europe. Look at the last MEP elections here. Look at what the AfD's gains in Germany, or you look at what's happening in France, Hungary, of course, shining beacon of for others in the world on how to replicate this playbook of authoritarianism. So it's I don't think a lot of the civil society as we know it today will survive, particularly those linked to institutions and institutional fundings. Because it is literally, it's going to be a messy, nasty fight being fought by those who are willing to pay the price. And that is not the price that most institutional civil society players are willing to pay. And you know, I think it will emerge, something new will emerge out of this churning. We don't know how long this phase will last. And it certainly won't end if Trump doesn't get reelected. It's a long haul. It's another 20, 30 years that you're looking at. So it's very hard to say with any certainty on what the shape of the fight will look like. What we can say with certainty is traditional actors, including myself, may just not be up for this fight. Yeah.
Just a question on the front row, I think.
Hello, I'm Guy. I'm just wondering, as a scholar in the global north, a lot of spotlight is kind of being shown that we should find solutions in ideologies of the global south and alternatives to thinking. I'm just wondering then, what do you think you mentioned that we are now starting to think of rivers as having rights, these ideologies are entering the sphere, but what's the role of the scholar of the global north in these conversations? Because the most that I see that we're saying is, oh, we need answers from them. And do you think it's right that the responsibility is kind of being placed on the global south to find solutions, and then what's the role of us here?
Thank you.
There's one by the stairs.
Hi, I'm Jasmine. I was wondering, you've given us a lot of really sort of stark, depressing statistics and laid out some really urgent social problems. So my question is, what gives you hope?
Yeah, okay. So I'll start with you. In fact, that will answer in part what was asked earlier. What's the role of academia? I think first, distinguish the peoples of the global south from the state, right? The global south is not the government of India, the government of Brazil, the government of Mexico. It is communities who have been fighting climate change for centuries, indigenous communities who have protected the forest, protected nature, who have a great sense of things going wrong when they go wrong, and an innate sense of how to fix them, right? Who have a different framework than you and I have. So are you willing to give up your intellectual hegemony to recognize that there could be someone out there who completely operates differently from your normative framework, whose life is a solution that you were not willing to take up because it didn't match up to the framework that you have for yourself? So I think as academia, we don't see enough of that happening. We're just still stuck, Western academia is still stuck to frameworks that they have created for themselves. And of course it's linked to funding. Of course it's linked to how the state wants you to be seen, and then you make a career out of it, because it's, in academia in the UK, for instance, it's life from one ESRC grant to another, because you have to have your, what do you call it here, excellence frameworks. Yes, of course. So I reliably learn you'll have one on social media as well soon, How many Instagram followers you need for promotion. But that apart, so you're starting out now. There is nothing that prevents you as an academic to do what needs to be done, which is spend time with the communities whose very existence today. You may say at the lowest level of human development and achievement because they'll never be here in this room, or they'll never leave their mountainside that they've lived in. But within their framework, and today what the world needs is absolutely far more civilizationally superior than anything the world has had to offer so far. So if we have the humility to learn from them, we will fix it. And that's the role I think that academia has to play, a very important role that academia and the global north can play. What gives me hope? What gives me hope is the change that I have seen in my own lifetime, in communities. I remember that when I started out in this work, my colleague Harsh Mandar and I, we went to a village where some starvation deaths had happened, and this was a community of people who were sort of unfairly stigmatized because they consumed rats or took the grain from the burrows of rats and then consumed that because they were poor. But the fact that they consumed those rats also unfairly stigmatized them, because from a food sovereignty framework that should be all right, not from out of destitution, but if that's something they wanted to do. And I still remember that, because hunger is so stigmatized, you never admit that you're hungry. And the women wouldn't admit that they were hungry, or the children suffered from hunger. But at some stage when we probed on what is it that they did to cope with hunger, and they started weeping, and one of them said that if it's a very young child, we can't beat the child to sleep, which we would do with the older child, because you beat them, they'll cry and they'll go to sleep. But if it's a very young child, we just take a pinch of intoxicant and put it between their lips. So from that stage, which I have seen, where the hardest lesson a mother could teach her child was the lesson of how to live with hunger. I do see hope that we don't have that level of destitution today in India, and that's clearly something of the past. For most part, starvation deaths are a complete thing of the past in India. And this has happened within my lifetime of work with these communities. So that gives me hope. I think if there are enough people in the UK who say that, how have we landed up in a situation where 22% of our children live in poverty, or that 1 in 5 families is dependent on food banks? Imagine how hard it must be for a mother here in the UK. The shame associated with of being a parent and not being able to take care of your kid, to stand in a queue in a food bank, or to teach your child how to skip a meal. There is no way that a country like the UK or any society today in this age, with the kind of money we have and the access to resources we have, no mother should have to teach their child that. And it's happening in our neighborhoods. It's happening. I'm so glad to see that groups like community groups that we have represented here in this room are really taking this fight on. But if there is that sense of outrage, I think there is hope, because, organize, educate, agitate, that's going to happen if things don't improve. So I do see a lot of hope in that sense. Yeah.
I think there was a question on the front row, and then there's a couple more down there.
Thank you, Catherine. And India's state system, do you feel in any way that that's something that could give civic society a bit more agency, in that states could take things into their own hands? Or under Modi, is that just not possible because the federal government has kind of swallowed everything, so to speak?
Yeah. Okay, just 2 more.
Thank you for the lecture. So I have 2 questions. One is, I recently read that what we will be facing in the future, like you had stated, is a food shortage, which sort of reverses our food security that we achieved after the Green Revolution. But also there was a problem with the revolution itself. It's that we had an abundance, but it was not reaching the most marginalized. So on one side there's inequality, and now we will also be facing food shortages. Then all that progress that we made since 2013 or like after, are we going to backtrack on that progress because of this double thing, or like you said, there's still the silver lining of hope?
For interesting talk. I'm Andy. It's a follow-up on the sort of indigenous knowledges question. So I'm just wondering if you've got more thoughts, because as individuals we can take on and develop new ways of being, new philosophies, new ways to frame our research. But I'm wondering how, as societies, do we take on a more relational way of being and doing, involving caring for the earth rather than being more extractive? And therefore, how does that, as society, challenge capitalism, which is this root cause of the capital scene and of inequalities?
I would argue the reverse. A lot of people, I mean, yesterday in the seminar, Bangladeshi scholar here, Mehboob, I don't know if he's in the audience, but he asked me a question. He says, why does South Asia, why do things look so bleak in South Asia? And I said, look, I don't agree with that, because look at what happened in Bangladesh. You know, you had an authoritarian who was thrown out by a people's revolution. Whatever anyone may tell you, it was the people students who came to the streets and threw authoritarian out. In Sri Lanka, I lived there for 4 years. Even 2 weeks before it happened, I could not have predicted that there would be a revolution, the Aragalya, which would throw out the Rajapaksas, who were the authoritarians there. In Pakistan, you had elections where every hurdle was placed in the way of a political party which was almost extinguished. They took away their slogan, they banned the party, banned their election symbol. There was no way in hell they were going to put anyone in parliament. The young in Pakistan gave a stinging rebuke to the army by electing large number of PTI supporters into parliament, right? Even though they weren't from that political party. And India, of course, the stinging rebuke that has been delivered to this government. So, you know, we often get hopeless because we see events in the context of our lifetime and what agency we have to be participants in that events. But history takes a larger sway, it takes its own path. And as I said, it's a question of another 10, 15, 20 years. But the wheel will turn. And I see a lot of that happening in India and across South Asia today. I could not have imagined the events that I described in South Asia, even 3 years back. It's also harder to predict because post-Arab Spring, as we are seeing, you know, the reality is that neoliberalism, and you know a bit about that here since it was invented here, every town in the surrounding areas, which is the throbbing industrial heartland of the UK, is you know, the kind of desolation you see there is incredible. But what it did was that it essentially killed the trade union movement everywhere. And trade unions and the organized left had a much higher share of the protests, the space of protests, than the overall population. So therefore, what you're seeing today as change is being driven essentially, and I don't use it in a pejorative sense, but by a mob, it doesn't have a manifesto, is not organized, may not be focused on the outcomes, does not think long term. But people exercising their agency, coming together and displacing. You may not see an immediate impact. In fact, things might get worse because you don't have the longer term stability that organized action can have. But out of this, something will emerge. Today, there is no space, but tomorrow things will change. Kanimani, thank you. You've come down from Oxford for this. You could have just watched it online, as I had said. No, I think, so there are two aspects to it. I mean, certainly in the short to medium term, we will face there will be crisis moments. But as I said, that the two things that will stand out is, one, it's not really the food shortage issue, but really the climate-led adverse event issue that's going to impact food security because of India's vulnerability on the coast. And that is a very open question as to where that will go. How much of it will go underground? What will be the size of the economic climate refugees which will come from the coast back to the cities? How many of our cities will survive the onslaught of climate change because of the rising temperatures? So I think it's a very, very open question. There is no sensible modeling available today. Because on the other hand, the scientists would argue that large swathes of North India, the upper reaches of the Himalayas, will become arable. that with melting snows and dipping temperatures, you could have the same situation where the Russians will be growing wheat in the steppes. So we don't have a sensible economic model which can, sort of pinpoint to a state intervention that could or could not work. So sorry, not helpful, but that's how it is. On Andy's view on, how do we in our individual ways challenge, because this seems like a large problem then. How do we, resist it in every way that you can. You exercise your agency as a, I think all of us are activists now because, there are no rights on a dead planet. And we are facing a dead planet. If you want to save this planet, I have no illusions on why the young are so angry at us, because we are leaving them with a situation which is completely untenable. So I do think that, I don't know how much of the international order and rules-based order will survive from the debris of Khan Yunis in Gaza on one hand to Kharkiv in Ukraine on the other. But whatever comes of it, I think the fact that what's happening is the consequences are real, they're in front of us. The agency of the young will at some point either burn it all down to create a new system, or I don't know. Who knows? It's hard to say. I honestly don't know how I would respond to whether or not we can, at this late stage capitalism, how soon or how fast or how with individual agency can be overturned.
Just one question there towards the back, and then one on the right.
Hi, I'm Nikita. Thanks for the lecture. Big fan of the Right to Food movement and all the legislation that went behind it. I was wondering if there's a pathway that you see within judicial activism when it comes to, the whole shrinkage of civil society space that we're seeing in India. There's also talk about how the judicial system is also getting hollowed out. Is there a pathway that you see over there for civil society, maybe?
Okay.
Thank you as well for the lecture. I was wondering, you talked a lot about community, and you've also talked a lot in the lecture about policies and instating programs and stuff. I was just wondering, especially when you mentioned the food miles, what do you think is more important, or if they're just as important, what do you think should be prioritized more, community-based education and growth and agriculture, or more focus on more pressure on the government for policies and stuff to try and increase this food security?
Thanks, Biraj, for a really interesting talk. Sorry, my name's Chris. I was wondering if you could talk perhaps a little bit about the kind of politics of redistribution and taxation, because in many ways I'm a great supporter of universalism, but it's controversial, particularly when you've got taxation that is concentrated amongst what appears to be the poorest people. So people who are particularly poor, perhaps paying taxes on food that then goes to people who are not quite so poor, and so on. I was wondering if you could talk us through those issues.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah. So, Chris, let me start with your question first on redistribution. Again, as the Oxfam report suggests, the solution is staring us at the face, right? There's no reason why countries should not have a wealth tax. If I take India, for example, where I gave you the figures on, if you took the top 100 billionaires in India, right, just 100 of the 291 billionaires, and you just tax them 2.5% of their total wealth. That's it. A 2.5% wealth tax on the top 100 billionaires. You would be able to put 150 million children back in school, right? So it's staring at us, right? And this is a 2.5% wealth tax. I'm not even talking about the income tax that they don't pay, or the corporate tax that they don't pay, right? Because we also have systems like Ireland and others have, which allow companies to get away by not paying a single penny in corporate taxes. So even if you didn't do that, you said, okay, doesn't matter, don't pay your taxes, we'll just tax you 2.5%. If you take the top 10 billionaires of India and tax them 5%, you could fund the health program for 7 years in India. Our equivalent of, we don't have equivalent of the NHS, but the National Health Mission that we have. So the redistribution logic is clear, it's compelling. Many billionaires have joined the race to say this themselves, but governments will not do it. Because there is a fear, I mean, one is that if I do it, but Ireland doesn't do it, all the businesses will move to Ireland. So why should I do it? There is also the fear that my electoral contributions will come down if I spoke about it. There's a fear that I will spook the markets. My stock market will come crashing down. If the bird of redistribution settled on the branch anywhere close to a finance ministry, anywhere in the world. So the logic is clear, it's compelling. Who can argue against it? I think one needs to make similar calculations for every county, for every province, for every country, for every state, and show what even at 1% or a 2% tax can achieve, and then organize around that, because it's a complete no-brainer and should happen.
Thank you. I wonder if we should give Biraj a chance to rest his legs and his voice, because you've been dealing really well with all those. So it falls to me to thank you, the audience, for those great questions. I think we have a chance in a moment for you to meet Biraj over a drink. Be gentle, I think, because you've answered a lot of questions already. Thanks, Biraj, for a fascinating talk. I think you've generated, obviously, a great deal of discussion here amongst the audience, and it's been, speak on behalf of my colleagues, wonderful to have you here for a couple of days, and supported by our sociology department, one of the best in the world, I should add, for locals that don't always know that, but we've got an advocate here. Yes, thanks for your talk.
Thank you very much for coming. Thank you.